Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal. I am your host, Eric Freeman. On this week's episode, we are talking Nashville Haunted Handbook with one of the authors, Jeff Morris. The book features many places around Middle Tennessee, from cemeteries to hotels and parks. How you doing today, Jeff? Thanks for joining us.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Not a problem. So we'll just jump right into it. How'd you get into the paranormal, writing about the paranormal?
Well, I'm actually from Cincinnati, Ohio, and there were some interesting stories about the history of Cincinnati that were like people dying and these very strange things that I had never heard of living in Cincinnati all my life. I thought that was fascinating. So I wanted a way to, I guess, get people interested in that. I wanted to write a book, and I went to college for writing, and I wanted to write a book that really got people into the history of Cincinnati, but nobody really wants to read a history book. So as I was reading all these interesting stories about, I know Cincinnati isn't really where you're focused on, but there's a music venue in Cincinnati called Music Hall. And that was actually built on top of an old potter's field, an old pauper's cemetery there. And as they were building Music Hall, they were just digging up graves. And then several years later, they were still digging up graves. And I thought that was fascinating. And then I learned that Music Hall was supposedly very, very haunted by this whole situation where, it was built on the old cemetery. So I thought that, hey, maybe I'll look into the ghost stories behind all these interesting historic things that happened in the city, and they just all came together. So I wrote my first book through Arcadia Publishing, which talked about the history a lot and had historic photos and everything, and then it went into the ghost stories, and then another publisher picked me up, the Keen Communications, who does the Haunted Handbook series, and they wanted me to do another book about Cincinnati, and I wanted it to be more of an interactive type of thing where it not only tells you how to get there, but it tells you the history behind the place, it tells you all the ghost stories, and then it adds a section where it tells you if you wanted to actually go there and look for the ghosts, it tells you how you do that. Like, is it closed past this time? Are you going to get arrested if you try to go to a cemetery after dark and things like that?
Right. And that's one of the things that caught my attention about the book, is that it's unique in that it gives you the directions how to get there, the history, the stories, and then also if you can visit or not, and if you can, how to visit. I've never seen that in any of the other paranormal books that I've read, and y'all also have lots of really awesome stories in there, and it's really extensive as far as it's not just Nashville per se, and I'm sure the Cincinnati one is not just Cincinnati, it's kind of the greater area around.
Right. We take a target city and we try to get 100 locations within a 1 hour drive of the city center. So for the Nashville book, I hate that I didn't check to make sure, but I'm thinking that this one has a list in the back of locations that we wanted to put in, but they were just a little more than an hour away from the city center of Nashville, so we didn't do it.
And y'all pretty much cover Middle Tennessee in the book, from the north of Nashville to south of Nashville, and everything from cemeteries to hotels and restaurants and parks, and it's just really in depth.
Right. It like the themes that kind of come out in the book there's the Civil War theme, because there was a lot that happened during the Civil War in that area. The thing that pops out in my head is the Sam Davis house. I love the story behind that, where Sam Davis was a Confederate who was wounded and he couldn't fight anymore, but he was running correspondence between Union lines and Confederate lines, and he got captured, and he was a young kid at the time, and the Union captured him and were going to execute him unless he were to give up the name of the person who gave him the the Union battle plans, and he refused to do it. And even though he refused to do it, everybody didn't want to kill him because he was just a little kid, and they kept begging him, please, please, please tell us. And he never did. And at the last moment, the executioner is about to kill Sam Davis, and he clearly seems hesitant. It clearly seems like he's not going to do it. And Sam Davis says, "I did my job, now you do yours," which I love that quote. Apparently his house, or his family's house, is there in the Nashville area, and is haunted by the mother and the family of Sam Davis. And you hear cries coming from the house, and figures walking around within the house. But the biggest story is those cries, the people crying that you hear, even though there's no one around that are crying. And I just like that story, and just there's battlefields there, and old houses, plantations, and things like that. And the second thing, beyond the Civil War, that was a theme kind of that I found in Nashville, was the whole country music thing. All kinds of honky tonks, and of course the Ryman and Opryland and things like that, which seems completely different from the whole Civil War theme, but it's just these two things are the main themes there. And of course, there's all kinds of other stories that are just weird, but those are the two main themes that I ran across.
Yeah, and then when it comes to the cemeteries, a lot of people, that's kind of where they get their paranormal start, is going to cemeteries, and you think, why would dead people hang out at a cemetery? But I guess there's just as much emotion in a cemetery as there is in a building, and so it can hold on to that too. And
right, if a ghost, say, is the leftover emotion or energy from a very, like back many years ago, I don't remember exactly how long ago it was, but one of my favorite ghost stories that I heard was that I think it was in the UK somewhere. There was this woman who this guy breaks into her apartment and brutally beats and rapes her, like totally brutally beats and rapes her. And then and then people who were in that apartment after that, they would report hearing screams, even though no one was there, and bumps and shuffling and things like that. But what fascinates me about that story is that the woman, the victim in this story, never actually died. She survived it. So perhaps the ghost isn't really coming back from the dead, but just an imprint of whatever horrible thing happened in that location that has imprinted itself on the location. If you're talking about cemeteries, nothing really bad actually typically happens in a cemetery. It's more about the aftermath, where you move the body, is the cemetery. Even though there are plenty of cemeteries in the book, and I've run into lots of haunted cemeteries, and people say they're probably one of the top 3 most haunted places in the United States is probably Bachelor's Grove in Chicago. But still, I do like that story where the victim didn't actually die, but her ghost still haunted the location.
yeah, and in the paranormal community, there's a theory. It's basically a tape theory. So, like old VHS tapes, cassette tapes, if you can record on a magnetic strip, the Earth has a huge magnetic field, and we put off a electromagnetic field as well. So, it can imprint into stone, and they use quartz, and quartz is everywhere, and you use quartz for like watches and stuff like that. So it can store energy, and so yeah, that's just a replaying when the conditions are right. It's playing like an old VHS tape or something.
Right. Completely buy into that. And I know that there's different kinds of ghosts. There's ghosts that interact, which would not go into that whole theory, but there are ghosts where you just see a replay of what had happened in the traumatic experience, which that would make complete sense. Why not imprint it on something else? And who's to say that we can't experience that replay of that whenever the conditions are right?
And so, did you have any personal experiences writing the Nashville Haunted Handbook or any of the others?
When I was writing the book, I live in Cincinnati. It's a 5-hour drive to get to Nashville from Cincinnati. So a couple times we drove down to, or actually Donna Marsh, she's one of the other authors. She lives in Nashville, so she was the local who knew the legends and things like that. But me and Garrett Merck, he actually lives up here in Cincinnati as well. We drove down to Nashville, so we had to spend the night there. So one of the nights that we spent there, we went to the Walking Horse Hotel in Wartrace. It's about almost an hour from the center of Nashville, and it actually is out of business now. It's not a working hotel anymore, but the Walking Horse Hotel is supposedly a haunted hotel. You would see a spectral horse walking through the downstairs of the building. You would see the horse's owner walking through the upstairs and things like that. But when we called them and asked if we could stay there and maybe look around for ghosts or something, he said, well, nobody's booked that night, so you can have the run of the entire hotel and set up all your ghost hunting stuff or whatever. I don't mind at all, which was really, really cool. I'd never actually had an experience like that before, where we'd have the run of an entire hotel to go around and look for ghosts and actually try to experience this. But when we went, there was the bottom floor, which was just gorgeous, but that's where most of the activity was said to take place. That's where you'd see the spectral horse. It would look like somebody was projecting a film and the horse would just go running through a wall or something like that. And then the second floor was where the working rooms were, and then the third floor was still under construction. But we had heard some stories about the third floor because it was being renovated and whatever. So we set up all our equipment on the top floor, and we sat there and asked questions. And at one point, I swear that I heard what sounded like a little girl, and I look over and I see what looked like a little girl duck behind a corner. And we went over there and we looked, and there was nothing there and nowhere where a little girl could have run. Like, of course, if something like that were to happen and the hotel owner is looking to get more guests in by the people writing a book to tell actual experiences that they had when they stayed there. But when we looked, there was nowhere that a little girl could have run. There was nothing that the owner could have done in order to trick us in order to see that. So that was, for the Nashville book, that was probably as close as I ever actually got to seeing a ghost.
Wow. We have quite a few places who around Middle Tennessee. I'm from Nashville area. A lot of them embrace the history, but then you have places that don't. They don't want anything to do with it. I know there's a few places around, especially like in Franklin with the Civil War stuff. They don't really care if you come around asking for the paranormal. Did you get anything like that with anybody trying to talk to somebody and they just didn't want anything to do with you?
Yes, but what you had just said with Franklin, actually, right before the pandemic started, we were down at the Lots House, which is right there at the Battle of Franklin, right across from the Carter House, and the tour guide there was wonderful. He was great, and it was great going through the house and seeing the whole house. And we asked him about the ghosts, and he said, well, I'm not supposed to talk about it, but he talked about how things where he was sure that no one had been in there, things had moved throughout the house. And he said that he would hear noises and things like that on the outside and things like that weren't out there, and they weren't actually there. And he said, I'm not supposed to talk about it, but yeah, I won't come here by myself at night.
Yeah, and I think actually they have opened up to paranormal investigations now because of the coronavirus and it affecting tourism. So now they're trying to get people to come in to pay to see the paranormal side of it and doing paranormal tours.
I did when we did go. They did have a ghost tour that was going on right outside on their lawn. Like that night, they had a sign up or something like that. So yeah, now that you mention that, that does sound familiar. But the people who don't want you to go in to look for ghosts, a lot of them you kind of understand because they're not there because of the ghosts. They're there for other reasons. Like if you go into the Ryman Auditorium asking about ghosts, they're not going to tell you about the ghosts there because that's not what they're about. They're about the country music. Have you been to the Wickham Stone Park?
I have not.
Oh yeah, that's probably my favorite, the creepiest place that I went while writing the book. It's well worth a trip. What it is some normal guy in the mid 1900s. He started to build statues, and they weren't great statues or anything. They look like something that you'd see at an oddity stand along the side of the road when traveling across the country or something like that. But he built these statues, and they're in the middle of nowhere, and I think it's in Palmyra. Yeah, Palmyra. So he built all these statues, which just on their own would be creepy if they were just on the side of the road in this country road in the middle of nowhere in Palmyra, Tennessee. But the vandals came in and started destroying all the statues. So most of them are headless, and they have graffiti all over them, which on one hand is sad because he spent all this time building these statues and they were vandalized by all these people coming in. But if you're there looking for something creepy, a whole bunch of headless statues along this road in the middle of nowhere, like if you were just driving down this road and you had no idea what you were driving into, it would be the creepiest thing that you've ever seen, with all these headless statues with graffiti all over them. And
Right.
apparently they're haunted by the sculptor, who comes back to try to stop people from vandalizing his statues, which makes sense. But that's something where the locals, of course, they're going to be upset that this roadside oddity that they had have been vandalized and whatever. And of course, they're not going to think that headless statues with graffiti all over them are going to be of the same, or what the artist intended, I guess.
Right. And what are some of the strangest stories that you've heard from people? I know one of the ones in the introduction is something about in White Bluff, Tennessee, a llama that goes around and eats children.
Yes. It's not necessarily a llama. The White Screamer of White Bluff. That's one of my favorites as well. But what that essentially is the first story that we were able to find historically was in White Bluff. This guy on his farm, he kept hearing these screams coming from the woods, like terrifying screams. So eventually he went out to try to find the source of these screams. And this might not be a ghost story, it might be a cryptid story, but regardless, he went out to look for the source of the screams. And then his dogs, when he was out looking, got all freaked out and ran back to the house. And when he went back to the house, he found that his 7 children and his wife had been brutally murdered in the house. So what the story behind it is, apparently people in White Bluff will still hear those screams coming from the woods all the time. And some people, when people see the White Screamer in White Bluff, there's all kinds of different stories that they tell about what it is. Most of the time it's like a white apparition type of figure. People compare it to the Banshee in England or something like that. Other people say it's like a wolf or something, and some people say that it looks like an alpaca, a white alpaca, which strikes me as absolutely hilarious. And imagine this alpaca going through the little town of White Bluff and killing children and eating children. I did recently hear a little more history that might bring a little more depth to this story. Apparently there was a circus train that crashed. I forget the name of the town, but it's just north of White Bluff. And all the animals and everything were accounted for, except for there was something that they marked on the manifest of the train as a wolf man, and and the wolf man was never found. So some people suggest that the wolf man escaped from the circus and went around killing children in White Bluff at that time, because it started at around the same time that happened.
I have some family that lives in White Bluff, and the last thing that belongs in White Bluff is a llama or an alpaca.
Have they heard the screams?
Some of them have claimed to. I call myself a skeptical believer in the paranormal, And so I think it's just, we have bobcats around here, and when they're in heat, they scream, and it sounds like a woman screaming. Like, help me is what it sounds like from, like, especially if you're in like a valley, like a holler. It kind of echoes, and it sounds like a woman screaming, and I think that's what they're hearing. But I've also heard firsthand accounts of people actually seeing the white, like misty type apparition that has become attributed to the white screamer as well. They've never said that it was the screams with the apparition. They've just seen the apparition on the road, so it might not be anything related.
Yeah, when I think of the stories that I heard, I'm not sure. I think that it was just an assumption made that the screams and the apparition or the llama or whatever were related, because they never actually see the creature, the ghost screaming. They just hear the screams, and then they see the thing. So that could be as well.
So in writing, we've talked about, your stories around Nashville, and writing the other books, like the Cincinnati book. What other type of personal experiences have you had?
Unfortunately, there haven't been that many. I did a book in Minneapolis, Cincinnati, Chicago, and we did go to a lot of the places, but nothing's really popping out as something that I saw and can't really disprove or anything like that. Of course, Cincinnati, beyond working on the book, I ran a ghost tour here for a while, and I was part of several paranormal investigating groups. So there were little things that were kind of like, of course, there's that road that you're supposed to drive down, and then you see headlights behind you, and then in the middle of the night, the headlights just mysteriously vanish. I did experience something like that, but again, somebody could also know that same legend and turn off their lights and stop their car as I'm driving. So I'm not sure exactly that something like that happened. Trying to think of anything else that really jumps out, but nothing that I personally experienced is really jumping out at me.
What kind of future projects you got going on? Are you writing any other paranormal books or anything like that?
At this point, I just finished a novel that just came out called "Zombies: The True Story of the Titanic Disaster."
Awesome.
It is. It's an awesome book. But the publisher has suggested a few other locations for the Haunted Handbooks. I think they suggested Atlanta, Vegas, and St. Louis. The problem with Nashville is they ran into problems finding bookstores in Nashville. They said that there are no more big chain bookstores that exist in Nashville. So it's more difficult to do a book centered in a specific city if they don't have the big chain bookstores that are there. But that may change with the whole Amazon and the whole pandemic, where people don't actually go out to stores and order it on Amazon. So maybe that will change, and there could be cities that don't have the big chain bookstores. But at this point, I haven't signed a contract for any of those, but those are the ones that are up in the air.
Awesome. And I'm sure they can find the books on Amazon if they're interested in buying them.
Yeah, they're on Amazon. I think there's several retailers throughout the city somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where that have them. And when I did go back a few weeks ago, or I guess a couple months ago now, I was disappointed that a lot of my favorite locations from the book have gone out of business or aren't there anymore. I don't know if you ever went to Cuz's Antique Center when it was still around.
No, I don't remember that place.
It was a 3-story antique store, and it had a real electric chair from a Florida state prison where people had actually been executed in. Wow. And they actually had what they claim was a legitimate Bigfoot head sitting in the front window. The story was this married guy and an unmarried woman had been driving back from their tryst or whatever and had hit something, and the guy got out and saw that it was a person, so he drove the girlfriend back home and then went back out and saw that it was like covered with hair from head to toe. So he cut off the head and had it taxidermied. And apparently, somehow Cuz's antique store got it, which is just a wonderful story. And unfortunately, when I went back a couple months ago, Cuz is no longer there.
Yeah, that was in Lebanon. Yeah, a little east of Nashville.
Okay, yeah, I could open up the book, but you would know better than I. but a great story nonetheless. Regardless of whether it's true, which it sounds completely fabricated, something that an antique store would do to get people to come in. But at the same time, they have a supposed taxidermied Bigfoot head. It's like the Fiji mermaid from Barnum.
Yeah.
Where you get people to come in, and even after if it's fake or not, it's still interesting to go see.
Right. And that's, I mean, a paranormal book like this it's hard to prove any of it, but it's the fun of going out and exploring it for yourself. And that's why I think is awesome about the book is that you give the directions and, the visiting instructions so that people can go out and experience maybe themselves or think, oh, well, this is BS, but it's right. All in the journey and the stories.
Right. And it's got the history in there too. So regardless of whether you buy into the ghost stories or you want to go there and try to see the ghosts or anything like that, the worst case scenario, you learned a little bit about the history of the area.
Right. Well, I appreciate you coming on with me today. It's been an awesome conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Stay safe out there. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or at our website, unseenparanormalpodcast.wordpress.com. And don't forget to like, review, rate, and share with all your friends. Thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. Listen to our theme song and more of his music at chrislipsmusic.com. And remember, some of the scariest things are unseen.